Hi, I'm Ethan, and I'm going to be discussing with my team how we created an ISMS system for the University of Pembrokeshire and the methodology that came with that.
My name's Anthony. I'm going to be one of the presenters on this PowerPoint, and I'm going to introduce our case study. So we are looking at the University of Pembrokeshire, a modern university in southwest Wales with around 10,000 students and just over 1,100 staff. In the UK terms, that makes it a medium-sized university, but in our scenario, it's the biggest university in the southwest of Wales, so it has an important regional role. Its main objectives are education, research, and maintaining reputation and accreditation. All of these depend heavily on secure digital systems because it holds large amounts of personal, academic, research, and financial data. It is a very relevant example for showing why an ISMS is needed and how ISO 27001 can be applied. On this slide, we look at why UOP needs an information security management system in the first place. The university depends heavily on digital systems for teaching, assessment, research, student administration, payroll, and communications. So cybersecurity is not just a technical issue, but it's also a core business issue. There are also strong legal and regulatory drivers. The university handles large volumes of personal data about students and staff, so it must comply with UK GDPR and the Data Protection Act 2018. It also needs to be prepared for broad resilience and incident reporting expectations under laws such as PECR and NIS-related requirements. The reason an ISMS is important is that it gives the organization a structured way to identify risks, choose appropriate controls, monitor performance, and show evidence of compliance. In other words, the ISMS is not just about preventing attacks, but about protecting services, reducing risk to an acceptable level, and demonstrating due diligence. We selected ISO 27001 because it is an internationally recognized and certifiable standard for building and maintaining an information security management system. It is important because the university is a complex environment. It has teaching systems, research data, finance systems, staff records, third-party suppliers, and a wide user base. So ISO 27001 is suitable because it is risk-based and flexible enough to work across all of these areas rather than focusing on just one technical domain. Another major reason for choosing this framework is that it requires a statement of applicability, or SOA. That means we do not just list controls, but we have to justify which controls are included and why. We also compared ISO 27001 with other frameworks. NIST CSF is useful for communicating maturity and cyber priorities, and FAIR is useful for quantifying cyber risk financially, but neither of them on their own give us the same certifiable ISMS structure as ISO 27001, while other approaches can support it where useful.
By firstly identifying risks and negative business impacts that could occur, the team was then able to identify which security controls could lower the risk. We lowered risks by firstly identifying which vulnerabilities could a risk stem from. For example, no firewalls to determine what a student could install on a system owned by the university could lead to the threat of an installation of malware, which could then lead to the risk of the damaging of systems within the university, which could cost the university money, which would then be a business impact. By identifying the risks, we were then able to discuss controls which could lower the chances of risks through attempting to remove a vulnerability or lessen a vulnerability. By lessening possible threats and then reducing the risk, we then used ISO 27001 and the ISO 27000 family to ensure security controls followed a high standard, and then used our statement of applicability to determine the severity of these risks, as well as whether our controls applied to the university and whether this should be implemented or not.
Although ISO 27001 is our main ISMS framework, we also used FAIR as a supporting method for risk communication. The reason for this is that traditional risk registers often describe risk as high, medium, or low, but senior management often want to understand what that risk means in practical or financial terms. FAIR helps by breaking cyber risk into factors such as loss event frequency, vulnerability, and loss magnitude. This gives a more business-focused way of discussing risk, especially when we want to show why one scenario should be prioritized over another. It is also important to be clear that FAIR does not replace ISO 27001 in our project. As this provides the governance structure, the controls framework, and the SOA, FAIR complements that by helping us quantify selected risks and communicate them more effectively to decision makers. So the main message here is that we are combining a formal ISMS framework with a risk quantification method that gives both governance and stronger management communication. This slide shows an example of the FAIR output for the scenario of ransomware affecting student systems during term time. The purpose of this chart is to move beyond simply calling the risk high and instead show the range of likely loss outcomes. We've also created a histogram The key point is that this shows the distribution of possible loss values, so management can see both the most likely range and the possibility of more severe outcomes. What these add to the ISMS is better prioritization. It helps justify why some controls or investments should be implemented sooner, especially when the potential loss is so much greater than the cost of mitigation. So just remember that FAIR gives a cleaner, more decision-oriented view of risk exposure, while the ISO itself still provides the overall framework for governing and treating that risk.
Next, I'm going to talk about some security challenges a university can face. So universities are major targets for cybersecurity attacks, where in a survey conducted, 35 out of 62 universities admitted to facing a cyber attack in the past 10 years. With statistics this likely, security should be a major concern and not an afterthought. These attacks would disrupt the business goals of any university, but specific to the University of Pembrokeshire, it can cause leaking personal information, which would break credibility, causing downtime, which can cause disruption to teaching, or even possibly losing important files essential to research, or even intellectual property. These attacks on universities are often so serious that paying a ransom is the only option, where more than half of higher education institutions targeting ransomware attacks paid a ransom to get their data back. In other organisations, ransoms paid by University of California totaled the equivalent of £826,000 in 2020, and the University of Utah paid the equivalent of £343,000 in the same year. This high cost shows the seriousness of the topic and how security should be not treated as an afterthought in dealing with cyber attacks. Ensuring legal compliance in relation to data security is just as important as ensuring cybersecurity of the system, because of the high amounts of personal identifiable information a university has on its staff and students. This could range from financial records, addresses, family information, or even medical records. Efforts at University of Pembrokeshire have already been made in attempts to mitigate this risk of data breach. However, further action should still be taken to mitigate, as many vulnerabilities are still present, such as the excessive elevated permissions on user accounts allowing for unauthorized access, which we'll expand on later. This data needs to be securely stored to ensure that university would not be required to pay heavy fines from legislation like the Data Protection Act or GDPR, which can reach up to a standard maximum fee of £8.7 million. This is an issue not exclusive to University of Pembrokeshire, being also experienced by the Greenwich University, who have fined £120,000 for a leak of student personal data. This risk is considered by us as very high and has had a serious consideration in the development of our proposed ISMS. Next, I'm going to pass over to Anthony, who will discuss how we've calculated these risks.
This slide explains how we identified and assessed risk. Our approach was mainly qualitative, using a likelihood and impact matrix because that is practical for an organisation like a university and works well when not every risk can be measured precisely in numerical terms. We started by identifying the university's important assets, business objectives, and key stakeholders. Then we considered threats that could affect those assets, such as ransomware, phishing, insider misuse, just to name a few. To make this more structured, we use ideas from Octave and Stride. Octave helped us think in an asset-based way, while Stride helped us check that we had covered a broad range of technical threat types, such as spoofing, tampering, information disclosure, denial of service, and privilege escalation. The output from this process was the risk register, which became the foundation of the ISMS. In other words, the controls we recommended later are not random choices, they're directly driven by the risks we identified through this assessment process.
By default, all users have some level of elevated permissions on the organization's servers. This statistically increases the risk of unauthorized access or snooping of sensitive data, like personally identifiable information or intellectual property. This can be mitigated by re-evaluation of account permissions to ensure users can only access necessary files, which makes interacting with these off-limit files far more difficult. Insider involvement is found in 35% of data breaches, so consideration of employee access is crucial. This data is referenced from SOBR's 2025, and this can be mitigated by ensuring access permissions are kept to only necessities per individual. A user, or in this case a student or staff, should be only able to access the data and files that they need and no more than that. The ISMS would also enforce the creation of audit logs for high permission users, which allows for the monitoring of actions which could pose the organisation harm. This prevents possible attacks before they may occur. The effect of these mitigations would reduce the risk score from very high to low, effectively mitigating the risk and reducing chances of a cyber attack as a result of privilege levels. Currently, the university lacks appropriate protection from DDoS attacks, which can limit the amount of traffic flow an organisation can get, restricting essential actions from being processed in orderly time, causing disruption to the university and a loss of money through not being able to run services. To mitigate this risk, the ISMS would enforce the use of cloud DDoS protection services and encourage the capacity planning which ensures that bandwidth exceeds the maximum amount of legitimate internet traffic. Upgrades to the system firewalls would also be essential, such as the introduction of next-generation firewalls like Palo Alto. These would further handle threats, and the risk of inadequate DDoS protection is initially a high-risk rating, but after mitigation techniques it would be rated as a low risk. The university does not have requirements for strong passwords as of currently, or the policy of updating old passwords regularly. This means accounts would have weak passwords such as password 123, which makes them far easier to guess. So easily guessable passwords for extended duration of time leaves them ample opportunity for a brute force attack. To mitigate these risks, we would ensure that multi-factor authentication methods are used by all user accounts, and secret authentication information is kept completely private. This ensures that stronger password requirements and additional layers of security are needed to log into the system. This is essential because accounts with elevated permissions have a lot of power, so unauthorized access of this account could allow for the damaging or malicious activities. The risk initially scored as very high, although after mitigation would be scored as a low.
Next, I'm going to be looking at how the ISMS ensures proper legal compliance. So due to the high importance of proper storage of personally identifiable information, legal requirements on the security and treatment of this data is strict and difficult to manage without an up-to-date ISMS. The ISMS would ensure that this is followed through providing a legal framework to meet legal requirements, providing guidelines to follow that ensure compliance, while under review and flexible to change alongside regulatory bodies, legal requirements or organisational focus change. This would allow the university to be able to be sure that the information system provides an accurate framework for legal compliance. The ISMS follows a Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, which helps in identifying required laws to comply with, or specific aspects required by the organisation before full implementation. Later on in its life cycle, usually between 6 to 12 months, this then gets audited to test for its effectiveness, then changes made if necessary. This allows for the ISMS to be created for the regulations, instead of those regulations being an afterthought. For further clarification on different ways the ISMS would ensure proper legal compliance, this table breaks down the requirement and how the ISMS applies. Next, I'll be discussing some of the primary challenges with the proposed ISMS, and I'll give some of our recommendations to overcome these. The first one being a budgetary issue. So the ISMS would be a very expensive security system to implement, as it's a very big change and a vast number of new services would need to be implemented, which would all require significant budgetary requirements, approval of which might be hard to justify. To oppose this, we would emphasise that while the cost upfront is high, yes, compared to one of the many fines that are required to be paid for not following the established laws, this ISMS cost is a fraction in comparison and mitigates the chance of ever needing to pay any of them. So another issue could be through user adoption. So the ISMS scope is for a university with about 11,000 users, which is split between 10,000 students and roughly 1,000 staff members. Many of these users might face difficulty following the new requirements, whether it's out of dislike for the new security rules, whether it's inconvenient or in favour of the previous methodology. Furthermore, a full rollout of all 11,000 users is difficult to manage, and feedback could be difficult to filter through from the quantity. We would encourage following the framework we propose because of this, which is where monthly meetings with senior staff members providing grounds to ask questions or petition changes is organised. This would improve the usability and the standard it would be followed at. Furthermore, due to the large nature of the change and the quantity of individuals affected, a phased rollout system would be used, which would ensure that initial feedback is acted on and new changes can be taken into consideration before wider adoption of the ISMS. The final main challenge would be accuracy and relevance over time. So the ISMS is designed to last an extended duration of time without losing its relevance or accuracy to the current needs of the organisation. Because of this, we recommend a standard practice in ISMS usage, which is routine meetings evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of the system, which allow it to develop over time and stay relevant. We usually schedule these between 6 and 12 months, depending on customer thoughts on its performance and regularity of changes that need to be made. Just to wrap up, the ISMS would benefit the university by protecting it legally and digitally. The implementation would follow the ISO 27001 methodology, using a fair risk analysis. The ISMS would help the university develop its information security policy and ensure correct practice in its use in benefiting all users.